Before we get started, we're going to take 30 seconds to do a really, really cheap parlor trick to get more people to get in here. So this is the part where, so this talk might be like a 4 out of 10, but this is the part where like I've just dropped some crazy CVE that just like broke, I don't know, quantum computing or something like that. Alright, so just make as much noise as you possibly can. Just to like social engineer people into thinking there's something really awesome going on here. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, we're good. I just watched a couple more people trickle in. We should do this at the social engineering CTF, shouldn't we? We'd all get like, I don't know, like a snack badge or something like that. All right, so just like adjust this thing. If I'm back here, can you guys hear me? Or do I have to kind of lean in like this? Does this thing like expand telescopically? If I just kind of get a stool and just, okay, never mind. Alright, so my name's Gabriel. I work for a company called Digital Silence. I'm a co-founder and senior security assessment manager there. I'm going to skip like the really long like bio description just to save time. Basically, we're a pen test firm that is like 10 dudes, and we actually give a shit about pen testing, which is a novelty. But so I used to work for a firm called Gotham Digital Silence. I was based in their New York office. Did a lot of their red teaming and wireless stuff. My LinkedIn handle is kind of interesting. It's ms08067. I love it when people get the reference. Yeah. So this is a talk about 802.1x, which, previous versions of it have kind of been beaten into a dead horse, but gonna drop some interesting stuff here. But let's talk about what 802.1x is first and kind of just go over the basics. So 802.1x is an authentication protocol. It's used to protect local area networks, and even wireless local area networks with rudimentary authentication. It defines an exchange between three parties: the supplicant, the authenticator, the authentication server. The supplicant's the client device that you're trying to connect to the network. The authenticator's, it's basically your switch. It's what the supplicant's connecting to get access to the network. And the authentication server is this host that's kind of chilling on the, in the background, and it's actually making the final decisions as to what gets to connect to this network and what does not. And it's usually running Radius or some similar AAA protocol to do that. So you can think of the authenticator once again as a gatekeeper. The supplicant's going to connect to it and provide it with a set of credentials. The authenticator is not going to know what to do with these, so it's just going to forward these on to the authentication server, which is going to validate the credentials and either allow or deny the device to access the network. Typically 802.1x is a 4-step sequence, as in like 99% of cases. It involves initialization, initiation, EAP negotiation, and authentication. We'll go over those in a second. Ports, so if you have a switch port that's protected by 802.1x, it's going to be in one of two states. It's either going to be authorized, in which you have traffic is completely unrestricted, or unauthorized, in which it's restricted to nothing but 802.1x related traffic. So we mentioned that the first step of the 802.1x process is initialization. Initialization, the supplicant's going to connect to the switch port, which is going to start out disabled. The authenticator is going to detect this new connection and enable the switch port in its unauthorized state. So you start with the port unauthorized. Then we move on to initiation. So this is where we initiate the authentication process. The optional first step is the supplicant's going to send an epoll start frame to the authenticator. The authenticator is going to respond with an EAP request identity frame. And the supplicant's going to, see that and respond with its username, because basically what's happening there is the authenticator is saying, who are you? Once again, the authenticator is really not going to know what to do with this, so it encapsulates it into a format that the authentication server can understand and forwards it off the authentication server. At this point, things get interesting. We mentioned that, so 802.1x is actually an encapsulation of Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, for use within this context. EAP, as you may know, can be implemented any number of ways. And long story short, they have, basically the supplicant and the authentication server have to agree on a method to do this. So they're going to haggle for a bit until they decide an EAP method they're both comfortable with, and then we'll move on to step 4, which is authentication. Specific details about how authentication should work, once again, are dependent on the method that we choose. But it'll always result of one of two things: EAP success or EAP failure. EAP success, of course, the authentication has succeeded, the port becomes open, or authorized, and the supplicant can now send traffic through it. Otherwise, the port's going to remain unauthorized. So we've been talking about EAP a lot. So what is it? We mentioned it's short for Extensible Authentication Protocol. It's an authentication framework, really. It's not really a protocol because it's only defining message formats. You can think about it as a black box for performing authentication. Individual implementations of EAP are known as EAP methods, and that's kind of where the nitty-gritty technical details of how this authentication is going to take place are actually defined. Some notable EAP methods, which we'll go into more detail later. EAP MD5, spoiler alert, sucks. EAP PEEP, it doesn't suck quite so bad, but it's been exploitable for 10 years, so I know it's just soap, but it looks really delicious, so I decided to put this in there. EAP TLS, so this is interesting because EAP TLS historically has been thought of the least shitty of these options, although there were some pretty awesome researchers from South Africa who released a way to bypass this in certain circumstances at Defcon last summer, so you might want to go look at that. I think it was Dom White, and handle is Cable Thief. I forget his full name, but go look at their work. Anyway, so alright, so now we've gone over EAP and 802.1x. Let's go over a brief history of wired port security. So 802.1x 2001 was the first version of the 802.1x standard, and this was released back in 2001. Who would have thought, right? And this was created to provide rudimentary authentication for local area networks. The protocol was expanded in 2004 to facilitate the use of 802.1x on wireless environments. And in 2005, which is just 1 year after that, we have the first working bypass of 802.1x 2004, and in wired environments, actually. And basically this researcher, Steve Riley, figured out you could just insert a hub between the supplicant and the authenticator, and that would allow you to passively snip traffic. I'll go over why that is later. So this is really cool because you can now it's a passive bypass. You can't really interact with the network unless you just want to inject UDP packets all day because, if you try TCP, you'll get a race condition. But it's a really good start. 2011, 6 years after that, Ab from Gabriel Security created a tool called Marvin, which actually was the first device to bypass 802.1x by introducing the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the switch rather than relying on a hub. And it did this using, basically by setting up a bridge in Linux, and full network interaction was achieved using packet injection. It was kind of like an unwieldy solution. Another researcher, and this is actually regarded as the classic 802.1x bypass, the one that most people just kind of go to when they need to do this. Alva Duckwall released a similar tool later that year at DEFCON. That basically, once again, it used a transparent bridge to place the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the switch. But unlike the Gremwall implementation, essentially, he was using source natting, using IP tables to just make it look like all the traffic leaving the rogue device were coming from the supplicant. So it's a much simpler, much cleaner attack, and that's the one that most people use when they have to do this. 2017, a researcher named Valerian Legrand created a tool called Fenrir, and it works similarly to Duckwall's tool, but implements the natting in Python using Scapy. So it works at a higher level. It's supposed to be easier to deploy, has a modular design, support for responder, etc. So whenever, in my opinion, whenever you start kind of like researching a new technology or even way to bypass a new technology, a really good starting point is to learn the existing work really, really well, and to see if there are opportunities to improve upon it or build off of it. Do that too. So some of the first things that I did here was take a closer look at Duckwall's 802.1x bypass. We mentioned that it uses a transparent bridge to silently introduce the rogue device between the supplicant and the authenticator. And the network interaction is achieved by using IP tables to create the source net. So one problem that Duckwall had to overcome is, if you're bypassing 802.1x, presumably you're doing this in an environment where you're not supposed to be. You're not going to just be presumably you're going to be on a red team or physical security assessment where you're dropping something off and you don't want to stick around very much tinkering with stuff. You want to get it, plant it and get out. But this means that you need some way to get back to this device, in order to use it. So at the time, there weren't a lot of really great side channel options, like LTE, et cetera. It wasn't really available in the commodity market. So Duckwall's solution was to do two things. One option that he provided was to create a hidden SSH service, using this, that basically, you do this using destination natting. So essentially, it's an SSH service that only you can see, and you can connect to the device that way. That was more of a proof of concept. When you think about it, it's on the internal network and probably behind NAT anyways. So the other solution he provides is that you just send an outgoing SSH tunnel that essentially gives you a reverse shell, if you will, on the rogue device. So the other problem that he had to overcome, which is that the Linux kernel will not forward ePOL packets over a bridge by default. Existing tools deal with this problem by either patching the Linux kernel, or in the case of Fenrir, relying on high-level libraries such as Scapy. There are problems with both of these approaches, although at the time that these tools were created, this wasn't really something that could be overcome. So relying on kernel patches, you run into the problem where it's unwieldy, you have to patch your kernel, and you also not only have to patch your kernel, but someone has to actively maintain that kernel patch. Because if you think of the typical development path of the Linux kernel is going like one way, right? If you stop maintaining it and suddenly it starts going the other way, like your patch is going to stop working. And actually that happened. There are no publicly available tools or kernel patches that will do this at this current time. And then the alternative, and I think this is why, by the way, I think the reason why Fenrir was created was kind of to deal with this issue. The alternative is to use a higher level implementation using like a scripting language or something like that. The problem is that can make the bridge slow under very heavy loads. And what happens when you introduce a bottleneck to a network and you're trying not to get caught? Well, you get caught. So fortunately, the situation has dramatically improved since Duckwall's contribution. As of 2012, ePOL bridging can actually be enabled not programmatically, but using the PROS file system. The PROS file system, if you're unaware, it's kind of like an API that the Linux kernel gives you to reconfigure things on the fly. So essentially you just set a value in a file, and the Linux kernel uses that as a config value. So what this means is that if you do that instead, you don't have to rely on patching anymore, which is great. Also, we mentioned that, we had to, kind of rely on outgoing SSH tunnels for side channel interaction. Remember this was 2011 when Duckwall's bypass came out. Cellular modems were pretty unsophisticated. They were slow. They were expensive. So the solution was to rely on SSH. The problems with this approach, well, there are a couple of them actually. The first problem is that it relies on the assumption that egress filtering can be bypassed, which it's not always the case, although, with a lot of determination, it's usually possible, but, and the other problem is that it relies on pushing traffic through the target network, which creates an opportunity for detection. So our updated implementation that I kind of threw in here, what I did was modify some of the firewall rules to get this to work, but I've actually made it so you can use a side channel interface to provide connectivity to the device. So whether you want to use some kind of radio or LTE dongle or whatever you want really, you can connect to it that way, not have to rely on that outbound connection. So here's just a quick demo of this bypass in action. Just going to define some things really fast. So on the left-hand side here, we have our attacker. The attacker's going to SSH into our rogue device. And then on the top right here, we have, this is a screen capture of the supplicant device, the workstation, that is connected to the switch. And the switch is this thing in the bottom right. This yellow Ethernet cable all the way to the right on the switch is the one that's connected to the supplicant up here. This green light right there indicates that the device is currently authenticated and connected. If you see this green light turn yellow, it means authentication is currently in progress. If you see it turn off and stay off, one of two things has happened. We've either disconnected the workstation from the switch, or we've been burned. It's detected us and it's locked the port. So hopefully that doesn't happen. So right, we're gonna SSH into the device here. I'm just kind of speed through that a little bit. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up that passive bypass, and that will let us get basically passively collect the meta information that we need to set up the full interaction. So we're going to create the bridge. It's just a simple command. You run it like this, and you see we're bringing the bridge up, and you'll notice here that this device, the workstation is just constantly pinging 8.8.8.8. It's Google's external DNS server that everyone uses. And if you see here, you'll notice that the destination hosts become unreachable. That's because we've disconnected the workstation from the switch by introducing the rogue device in between the two of them, and this light has turned off. So, now we're going to, we've run this, and you'll notice that the light turns back on. It's now green, and the workstation's able to keep pinging stuff. Which what this means is that we were able to successfully perform the passive bypass. So now we're going to set up full interaction because we actually want to be able to to push traffic onto the network. This is going to take a couple seconds. You're not going to really notice much from the perspective of either the switch or the supplicant, but you will notice that the script will finish executing after kind of obnoxiously hanging for a while, which it's doing now. And when it does that, we will be able to run an mmap scan from the rogue device as if it was coming from the supplicant. And bam, yeah, we were able to run just a very simple ping scan, and it worked. So the reason why all these attacks work that we just described, the hub-based one, the injection-based one, the bridges, all of it, they all take advantage of the same fundamental security issues that affect 802.1x 2004. Actually, security issues, should I say. And the first one of these is that the protocol does not provide encryption, right? It's not an encryption protocol. The other issue is that it does not perform authentication on a packet-by-packet basis, which kind of opens the door for all this nasty stuff. The solution to this that was introduced was another amendment to the 802.1x protocol called 802.1x 2010, which uses a technology called MACsec to provide layer 2 encryption that's performed on a hop-by-hop basis, and also provides packet-by-packet integrity checks. So this is pretty cool because the hop-by-hop encryption allows you to protect against bridge-based attacks, but also allows you to keep inspecting that data as it's in transit. So it's good from the perspective of the network administrator. It's good from the perspective of trying to stop these attacks. The 802.1x 2010 protocol works in 3 stages. We have the authentication and master key distribution and the session key agreement. This is very similar to what we saw before. And then we also have the session secure stage. The stage 1 is authentication. Essentially, this is exactly what we were looking at before when we talked about the main 4 steps of 802.1x. The only difference is we're going to get a little more stuff passed between the authenticator and the supplicant, at the very end of it. And also we have the next step we have the session key agreement. And when this happens, the authenticator is going to determine whether or not the supplicant is actually capable of supporting MACsec. And, if it is, you have the key name and SAC is installed on the supplicant, and then you proceed to stage 3. In which stage 3 is actually when MACsec is actively being used to encrypt all data from point to point. So, when thinking about how to get around this issue, right? To get around the, kind of how would you bypass this? I think whenever you're doing something like that, it's useful to kind of look for parallels, with similar technologies that have been bypassed in the past, because as everywhere else in InfoSec, history tends to repeat itself. This particular passage from the IEEE standard for 802.1x 2010, actually section 6.6, kind of stood out at me. It kind of implies that there's a similarity between similar technologies that are used to protect wireless networks and this new iteration of 802.1x that's being used to protect wired networks. And I think what they're alluding to is WPA. And in fact, there are parallels between MACsec and WPA in the way that it's used. Remember back in 2003, we had the release of WPA1, and that provided hop-by-hop layer 2 encryption from the access point to the base station. Base station is just the fancy way of saying, the device you're connecting to the wireless network, so your cell phone, your laptop, whatever. And, authentication was either provided using EAP, as we were looking at just, previously, or using a pre-shared key as a fallback or alternative. So that's WPA PSK. Especially once WPA2 was developed, injection-based attacks were really no longer possible due to, the introduction of layer 2 encryption. So this kind of this kind of actually resulted in a major paradigm shift in the way that wireless attacks were developed and implemented and executed. In that, instead of focusing on injection and intercepting traffic, wireless researchers and attackers began focusing on attacking the authentication mechanism. So attacks against PSK, you have the WPA handshake capture and resulting dictionary attack. You also have the more recent PMK ID attack. Then you have the rogue AP attacks that you'd use against EAP in cases where weak EAP methods are used. So if we fast forward a bit to 2010, we have the release of 802.1x 2010, which is appropriately named. So 802.1x 2010 is also providing hop-by-hop layer 2 encryption, this time using MACsec. And instead of doing, access point to base station, it's being done from the device to the switch, or from switch to switch even. Authentication is being provided once again by EAP or PSK as a fallback or alternative. So I think you kind of see where we're going with this. So, I guess my hypothesis here is that, the most obvious approach to take is to perform a similar shift of focus, since you cannot, use the bridge and injection-based attacks that were previously, that you could previously use against 802.1x 2004. The first thing that comes to mind is to try attacking the authentication mechanism. So PSK, I guess that would be some kind of dictionary attack. I'm still working on that, because I've been working on this, but, so no idea if that'll work or not. But EAP, why not try attacking weak EAP methods? Because they're pretty prevalent. That's the main takeaway of this talk that we're going to go over. So to kind of know what we're talking about in terms of attacks against weak EAP, let's talk, rewind a bit, talk about some more background information, talk about attacks against WPA2 using EAP. So this is a diagram of a particular EAP method called EAP PEEP, which is very, very prevalent in wireless environments. The first step of the EAP authentication mechanism is that...
Toot. Yep. Hey.
Hey. Hey.
Hey.
That's really loud.
Hey.
Yeah, so like actually the main takeaway of this talk is I'm here to do like, what's it called again? Like ventriloquism? Alright, so, hey. I hope you could hear this. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to lean into the mic a little more. This is my ADHD going nuts right now. So the first thing that's going to happen here is that the supplicant's going to send an authentication request to the authentication server. The authentication server is going to reply to that with an X509 certificate. Now, the reason why the authentication server is sending this X509 certificate is to make it so that the supplicant is able to trust the authentication server. So essentially, before this, what this certificate is doing is it's essentially trying to prove to the supplicant that the identity of the authentication server can be trusted. So at that point, the supplicant has, the decision to make. It can either accept the certificate as valid, in which case it's saying that it trusts the identity of the authentication server, it is who it says it is, or it can reject it. And if it rejects it, we discontinue this entire process. But if it accepts it, we create a secure tunnel between the supplicant and the authentication server. And the reason why we have this secure tunnel established is because what happens next is that we're gonna proceed from where we were before, which is the outer authentication of part of this process, to what's called the inner authentication part of this process, in which you're actually going to enter in your username and password and whole nine yards, and that's going to get put into a format that is supposed to be difficult to recover and then sent through the secure tunnel, right? And without the secure tunnel, you could just sniff that. So the problem with this process is that an attacker can anyone know what a rogue access point attack is? Okay, better question. Anyone not know what a rogue access point attack is? Yeah, basically. I'm going to go over it just in case, like, someone doesn't, but, the problem with this is that the attacker can perform an attack where essentially what you do is if you have a bunch of devices that are connected to this access point here, you force them to connect to your access point instead, which gives you a man in the middle. And actually the simplest way to do that is just to, create a network with perform what's called an evil twin, which you create a network with the same name as the target network, right? Like a hotspot or something like that. And then, make sure that you provide a better signal than the target access point, and that will just cause them to roam to your access point, and then you've got the man in the middle. And you can do that by either denying access to the target access point, providing better signal strength, or both. So remember that, with WPA, until this authentication process is finished, we're not benefiting from that encryption, because the encryption doesn't kick in until we authenticate with the network. What that means is that this is all happening over open Wi-Fi. And we just mentioned that open wireless networks are susceptible to this evil twin attack, right, where you can make these devices connect to you. So it follows that WPA2 EAP, when implemented in this fashion, is also susceptible to an evil twin attack, where instead of just getting them to connect to you, you get them to connect to you, and then you force them to authenticate with your own authentication server that you're running in the background. Present it with a bogus certificate. Hopefully they'll trust it. You'll probably find some bozo who will accept your certificate on any average organization. And they'll connect to you, and yeah, that'll be that. I mean, essentially they'll send you their, hashed versions of their creds, and you can crack those actually very quickly. Because, typically when you're looking at EAP PEEP, that inner authentication mechanism, which by the way is also extensible, you can swap it out for different types of inner authentication. But the most common one is MACsec V2, which is very, very poor. It's vulnerable to a cryptographic weakness that was discovered, also in 2012 by Moxie, Marlin, Spike, and David Holton. This is a bad year for Radius. Which essentially you can reduce it. I mean, it's essentially 3DES. Or it's analogous to NTLM v1 in that you can reduce it to a single 56 bits of encryption. And you can then convert those, 56 bits into a password equivalent NT hash, within 24 hours, 100% success rate if you use Moxie, Marlin, Spike, and David Holton's magical cracking rig, which at the time, that's a pretty high benchmark, but they made their cracking rig publicly available too. So, and now actually, I talked to David Holton recently, and he said that was like a $100,000 cracking rig back in 2012. You could now get the same hardware for $10,000-$20,000. So it's definitely within reach of, your mom and pop shop mobsters, let alone your nation states. Or your commodity pen testing firm, as the case may be. So back to 802.1x 2010. The most important takeaway about 802.1x 2010 from an attacker's perspective is that it also still uses EAP to authenticate devices to the network. That EAP authentication has to happen before we benefit from any of the new stuff that 802.1x provides. And as we just demonstrated, or discussed, should I say, EAP is only as secure as the EAP method used. Let's talk about some EAP methods that are supported by 802.1x 2010. The standard allows for any EAP method so long as it supports mutual authentication, supports derivation of keys that are at least 128 bits in length. And mutual authentication, by the way, that does not necessarily mean mutual authentication using certificates. It can mean mutual authentication in the same way that MACsec 2 does mutual authentication, which, look it up, it does at the very end. And you need to be able to generate an MSK of at least 64 octets. So there are plenty of commonly seen weak EAP methods that meet these requirements. EAP PEEP, EAP TTLS, etc. I think you see where this is going. So this is where we talk about defeating, how do we actually leverage these conclusions into an attack against, well, this slide says defeating MACsec using rogue gateway attacks. That's not entirely accurate. It's more like, this should actually say cowardly avoiding MACsec in order to defeat 802.1x 2010 using rogue gateway attacks in instances where weak EAP is used. But that's really long and you don't want to read that. So the goal is to perform this rogue gateway attack. We can't perform a rogue AP attack because we're not on a wireless network. But if we could somehow force the supplicant to authenticate with our device somehow and crack the hashes, and we could then use those cracked hashes to authenticate with the network. So let's think about how we could do this. Your traditional 802.1x 2004 bypass, or 802.1x 2004 bypass is going to use a man-in-the-middle style approach, in which you're going to have the rogue device, which you can kind of see here. Can you guys see my mouse? Okay, I can see my mouse, so cool. You're going to have the rogue device directly between the authenticator and the supplicant, and essentially you're going to use that to middle the connection. In this case, we can't really do that. At least no one's figured out how to do it yet. I don't like saying never, but it would appear that you can't do that. So, the approach we're going to have to take is direct access, where we just find a way to connect the rogue device directly to the switch without being detected, I might add. So let's build a rogue device that can do this. How would we actually build such a device? Well, let's just think about your typical, device that you'd use, your core device that you'd use to perform a traditional 802.1x bypass. In our case, because we're using a side channel for connectivity, we have the just like an Intel NUC or similar that's running Fedora 28. The reason I used Fedora 28 was that it has support for MACsec. And we have our transparent bridge. That becomes useful later, although not for this particular attack. We also have an upstream interface, and that's the interface that's connected to the switch. And we have the PHY interface, and that's the interface that is connected to the workstation. We need a way of diverting traffic to the rogue device. So let's think about how we can do that. Here's a train station, or rather should I say railroad tracks with a switch that leads to a train station. If you notice, there's this mechanical switch here where if it's in the A position, the train is just going to keep going into the station. But if it's in the B position, it will bypass the station entirely and just go around it. We can actually do something very similar with Ethernet using these. You can buy these for like $5 on Amazon. They're great. So these are mechanical AB Ethernet splitters. Here's the front. You can see there's two switches on here. When you hit switch A, traffic goes from this little back port, and is then connected to port A on the front of it. If you hit B, it's connected to port B on the front of it. So you can just kind of like reroute internet traffic in the same way that you could do with this train. We do need a way of manipulating the push switch, unless you want to hide somebody in the target, like data center or whatever. Just have them doing this all day, which it's obviously not going to work. So you need a way of manipulating the push switch. I actually tried using relays instead of push switches at first, to be honest with you, but I'm not an electrical engineer, and you can buy relays that don't have impedance issues when doing this kind of thing, but they cost like $1,000. So I'd rather just make this something that is easily reproducible, and also you could, build using stuff that's available in the commodity market. So the other option is to use something called a solenoid. And a solenoid, there are two types. There are pull solenoids, there are push solenoids. But essentially you have a metal rod that's surrounded by like a little wire that's used as a coil. You run current through the coil, and with a case of pull solenoid, it either just yanks the rod toward the inside of the coil. If it's a push solenoid, which is what we want, we push the rod outward, creating a push in motion. So it's a linear motor, essentially, I think. I'm not an electrical engineer, so if it's not a linear motor, whatever. So your full bypass, if we want to, integrate this with our existing core device. You see here with this diagram, we have these little triangles on the left and right. Those are our AB splitters. They're being manipulated by the solenoids, which are controlled by an Arduino, which is then hooked up as a slave to the to the Intel NUC. It sounds complicated, but it's actually not. It's just a lot of. Actually, it's not really that many moving parts. And then also, when the switches are in position A, we have a bypass. The traffic just bypasses the rogue device entirely. And then we have a passive tap, like a throwing star lamb tap or something like that, or similar implementation that just lets us passively sniff traffic without really putting any traffic onto the network. And that lets us, collect like MAC addresses, IP addresses, stuff like that. When they're in position B, traffic is redirected to our device, which is what we want. The switch here on the left goes to our upstream, and then the switch on the right goes to our PHY interface. So to perform this attack, this is the full setup here. We've inserted our device between the authenticator, which is on the left here, which is providing access to the internal network, and this workstation. We've brought down our upstream interface and our transparent bridge. We bring down the transparent bridge like basically permanently throughout this attack, so we're not using it. But we just bring the upstream interface down for now. But we leave our PHY interface up, and then we also start a rogue authentication server implemented using host APD to listen on the PHY interface. So what happens here is that this will cause a supplicant to, well, actually, you need to trigger this, but we'll talk about how to do that in the next portion of this. But if you trigger the supplicant to re-authenticate, it will authenticate with your rogue authentication server, which will allow you to capture credentials, and then at that point you can, crack the credentials and then just connect directly to the network by bringing down the PHY interface and bringing the upstream interface up with the supplicant's MAC address and the supplicant's IP address to set a static IP, so you get to keep its IP, and then submit the valid AP credentials. And if you do this during off hours, this is probably not going to be, as long as you're not causing a denial of service for this person over here, you're fine. This probably won't. You could probably get away with this in most cases. So here's our demo of actually doing this. Similar setup to before. We have the supplicant here. This time, actually, we have this really goofy-looking, blown-up, larger-than-life, prototype device here. You don't need to have solenoids that are this big. These things here are really big solenoids, but like when you create Frankenstein, you use like really big parts so that it's easier to work with. It's kind of the same deal with this, but you could make this smaller easily. And then here's our switch as before. Same rules apply. That's our port. Green means the same thing. Yellow means the same thing. No light means the same thing. And here's our attacker over here. So we're going to run this attack. This time we're actually going to manipulate these splitters here. You can kind of hear them. That's actually pretty loud, like if you're standing next to it. Like when I first got this to work, my wife came running in because she'd been convinced that I finally electrocuted myself with this thing. Fortunately, I didn't. But yeah, as you can see, we're able to just reroute the traffic to us and capture credentials. It was kind of that simple. So it's really kind of a cheap attack, but it works. So who cares? So yeah, that's our 802.1x 2010 bypass in cases where weak EAP is used. We're going to take a quick detour before we wrap this up and talk about MAC filtering and MAC authentication bypass. I ended up looking at this stuff as well. I was in the process of just ended up kind of going off in this direction briefly while looking at all this other stuff. So fun fact, not all devices support 802.1x. You don't say, right? But not all devices support 802.1x. Unfortunately, enterprise organizations with 802.1x protected networks usually still need a way to deploy these devices anyways. So you kind of have your hands tied, but you still need to connect these devices. The solution is usually to disable 802.1x on the port used by the device. And when you do this, you're creating what's known as a port security exception. 802.1x in this instance is usually replaced with some weaker form of access control, such as MAC filtering, but not always. But historically, these kinds of exceptions were essentially low-hanging fruit for attackers. They were very prevalent due to the widespread use or widespread lack, should I say, of 802.1x support by peripheral devices such as IP cameras and printers. And, frankly, spoofing a MAC address is a lot easier than going through the motions of trying to get the other stuff to work. So it's one of the first things you try to find. The problem is that port security exceptions are slowly dying. And, this is something that you're just starting to notice it now, especially if you do a lot of these. But, I think as time goes on, it's going to really get worse from the attacker's perspective. And the reason for this is that support for 802.1x by peripheral device manufacturers has actually increased dramatically. Legacy hardware is being phased out. It breaks, it reaches the end of its, specified lifespan, whatever. And when it does, it's replaced by 802.1x 802.1x capable models. And in fact, by the way, if you kind of want evidence of this, you can just kind of go online to like Newegg or whatever, and I'm sure you'll find at least, for every single manufacturer of, let's say, office scanners or something like that, you'll find at least one model that fits within an enterprise budget, or even just a small business budget, that supports 802.1x. It's kind of becoming more and more of a thing. I think we just said all this. But yeah, the result is that, port security exceptions are becoming less and less prevalent, and they're not really quite the low-hanging fruit that they used to be. So the problem is, though, that improved adoption of 802.1x doesn't really imply support, or should I say, does not really imply strong port security for peripheral devices. 802.1x 2010 support, it's not really a reality yet for peripheral devices. Actually, you're just starting to see 802.1x 2010 taking off with, the really expensive networking gear. Most of the biggest, I think the top, few, networking hardware vendors out there offer 802.1x 2010 support. But it's really expensive in most cases. And it's also something that, it's kind of flaky. It takes a lot to get it to work. 802.1x 2004, as we talked about earlier, can be bypassed using bridges, injections, etc. It used to be kind of a pain, although the tool that I'm releasing at the end of this makes it a lot easier. And also you can expect, adoption for secure APM methods are pretty low across the board, and they're even lower for stuff that isn't, manageable in a centralized way. That if you're talking about peripheral devices, it's not usually domain joined. So, it makes it a lot harder to just roll out a GPO or something like that will, enforce the use of a strong EAP method. So what about using EAP as a way of, attacking these peripheral devices instead of relying on port security exceptions? Well, you could actually use the rogue gateway attack, a simplified form of it, to do this. So, we see a similar diagram to what we saw before. We have the rogue device here. This time we actually make use of our transparent bridge. We don't need to use the solenoids for this. We instead start out with our classic 802.1x 2004 bypass, but if we want to actually get credentials as well, we can just bring this, the upstream interface down, the transparent bridge down, and then start host APD on our PHY interface, and then at that point, capture our 802.1x credentials that way. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is that something that you don't really see as much on in the rest of the environment. EAP-MD5 is actually widely used to protect peripheral devices such as printers. The reason for this is that EAP-MD5 it's pretty insecure, but it's also very easy to set up and configure, and it's still better than MAC filtering, right? So just a heads up, we're going to demonstrate how EAP-MD5 is actually really, really bad. But let's say that you're in a position where you've been told to roll out EAP authentication. Cool. 10 minutes. I think we're good. We're rolling toward the end. Okay, so, so essentially, let's say that you have to roll out 802.1x authentication across an entire network, and that includes peripheral devices. And, you have 2 hours to do it or some stupid, getting flashbacks here thinking about it. But, you could technically roll out EAP-MD5. It would be pretty insecure, but it's still better than MAC filtering. And you can say, yep, I rolled out 802.1x, all this stuff, guys. Yep. Not lying. So here's how EAP-MD5 works. Similar to before, the supplicant's going to, it's going to receive, an EAP request identity, frame from the authentication server. It's going to reply with its username, which is technically called the identity, but whatever. And the authentication server is then going to respond to that with an EAP challenge request. And this challenge request is going to be a randomly generated string that the supplicant is then going to have to throw through the MD5 hash. First it has to concatenate the challenge string with its username, its password. And once the username, the password, and the challenge string are all concatenated into one big string, that's thrown through the MD5 hash function. Out comes the challenge response, which is then sent to the authentication server. The authentication server then repeats that same process. It puts the user's identity, the password, and challenge string through the MD5 hash function, and then compares the output of that second hashing, should I say, with the response that was sent from the supplicant. If they match, you have an authentication success. If they don't match, well, authentication fails. Going back to the work that was kind of released by Brad Antonowitz and Josh Wright in 2008, this entire process happens over plain text, and basically everything that you'd need to perform a brute force attack. I mean, the only secret here is the password. You can get everything else just by sniffing traffic. So essentially what you can do is you can capture the response, the identity, and the challenge string, and then just, keep repeating that process the authentication server does, keep trying different passwords until you can create a response using the MD5 hash function that is equivalent to the one that you captured from the supplicant. And, it's kind of a slow attack. Because, it's a dictionary attack, it's, linear, if you ever study like runtime analysis or something like that, the rate at which it takes to do this is just going to increase linearly, which is not wonderful. But in 2012, there's also, a couple of researchers named, Fanbao Liu and Tao Zi. They released, additional researchers that shows that you can actually reduce this time using a length recovery attack. So there's that. So leveraging all this information that we now know about how to attack EAP-MD5, and also what we talked about, how we could attack 802.1x 2004, it gives us a pretty good approach for essentially how you attack EAP-MD5 on a wired network. I mean, you could start out by using a bridge-based bypass to place the rogue device directly between the supplicant and the authenticator. You could then wait for the supplicant to authenticate and then sniff all the required information, such as the EAP-MD5 challenge, the EAP-MD5 response, and the identity when it does. And then you'd use this to crack the credentials, then connect to the network, as we did before. The major drawback to this approach is that you have to wait for the supplicant to re-authenticate with the switch, and that actually will not happen unless the supplicant is unplugged. Disabling a virtual network interface isn't really enough. You can't just bring it down and bring it back up. That won't necessarily trigger re-authentication. You could use the mechanical splitters to force a disconnection. But, if we're just attacking peripheral devices, that's a lot of overhead for, not quite as much benefit. So the alternative is to use something that I kind of stumbled across while working on the rest of the stuff, and that's a forced re-authentication attack. So in this case, it's an EAP-MD5 forced re-authentication attack. Essentially, the first two steps, as we mentioned, of the EAP authentication process are that the supplicant is going to send the authenticator an epoll start frame. And that's saying, I want to start authenticating. The authenticator is then going to respond to that with an EAP request identity frame where it's saying, okay, who are you? Now, this first step of the process is optional. And the reason why this is optional is that the authenticator, the switch, needs a way of forcing devices to re-authenticate. So if it needs to get the device to start, to re-authenticate again, it just skips to step 2 and sends the EAP request identity frame. The problem with this is the supplicant has no way of verifying if an incoming EAP request identity frame has been sent in response to an epoll start frame or not. So this is a stateless transaction, right? So it doesn't actually, there's no way for it to remember whether or not it just sent an epoll start frame, and that's the reason why it's receiving this request identity frame. So what this means is that we can actually force re-authentication by sending an epoll start frame to the authenticator as if it came from the supplicant. You'd just use MAC spoofing and injection for this. The result is that the authenticator would send an EAP request at any frame to the actual supplicant. This would kickstart the authentication process, and both the authenticator and supplicant will believe that the other party has initiated the re-authentication attempt. And this is just kind of a quick demo of that happening. We're just using Scapy here to spam this thing and force it to re-authenticate over and over and over. It's kind of satisfying watching this, isn't it? In a weird way. Make a good GIF or something like that. We can revise our previous approach and kind of dub it the EAP-MD5 forced re-authentication attack by doing as follows. We'd first introduce the rogue device into the network directly between the authenticator and the supplicant. We'd start the transparent bridge to allow us to passively sniff traffic. We'd force re-authentication by sending a spoofed epoll start frame to the authenticator. Then we'd capture and crack the EAP-MD5 and EAP-MD5 challenge and EAP-MD5 response, as well as the identity. We'd use that to crack the password, preferably using the length recovery attack to speed things along a bit. And just to show you how quick this, how fast this is, we just run the command, and that's in that short space of time that we just saw, it re-authenticates, and we capture the challenge and response. So we got everything we need. So proposed mitigation, didn't really think about this too hard, but the first one that comes to mind is, maybe introducing some kind of like safety bit into the AAP request identity frame, or having some way to verify that, when the supplicant's receiving a request identity frame, that it actually should be receiving that. But yeah, should probably wrap up a little bit. So just some closing thoughts. The main contributions of this that we're talking about today, we have the rogue gateway, which can be used to bypass 802.1x 2010 by attacking its authentication mechanism. Very specifically, weak forms of EAP. If you use strong forms of EAP, this won't work. At least in its current form. There's other options, though, that were released in the past couple of months or so, namely the EAP relay attack that Dom White and Cable Thief did. Also, we've introduced some updated and improved existing 802.1x 2004 bypass techniques, and we've packaged them in a format that it's really, really easy to use, because I personally hate being on pen tests or red teams and stuff like that, and having to monkey around with stuff while I'm on someone else's budget. So introduce that. Think about it like Metasploit for bypassing 802.1x. It's a good way to describe it. And finally, we've introduced the EAP force authentication attack, which is a forced improved attack against EAP MD5 on wired networks. The key takeaways here: port security is still a very positive thing. Please keep using it. It is not, however, a substitute for a layered approach to network security. Deploying 802.1x does not absolve you from patch management responsibilities, password management, etc. You still have to do all that stuff. And also the benefits of 802.1x can be undermined due to continued use of EAP as an authentication mechanism, because EAP has kind of had it's a good, concept, but it's kind of had a flaky history, in terms of security, for a very long time in the wireless environment. And it's the same authentication mechanism, really. So it's kind of, the improvements that we've added to 802.1x are kind of, in some ways are undermined due to continued use of that. And finally, improved 802.1x support by peripheral device manufacturers is largely undermined due to lack of support for 802.1x 2010, and also low adoption support rates for strong EAP methods. If you want to read more about this, there's a blog post and white paper that you can get at digitalsilence.com/blog. I think it's the top result on there right now. There's also the tool that I'm talking about. That's at github.com/solstice/silentbridge. I know the least speak's annoying to type, but some other dude took the non-least speak version, so I just kind of had to roll with it. But yeah, that's it. Any questions? Thanks. Let's start in the front. Red shirt.
When a Windows, let's say a Windows machine reboots, it has the the supplicant, and it re-authenticates in order to have a valid pipe.
Yeah.
The user isn't logging in. What credentials do most Windows machines use in that situation to authenticate to the supplicant? Do you know?
So it depends. So essentially the first scenario is that it really depends on the AP method used. So if they're using APTLS, it's going to be a cert. That's already going to be configured to do that. If it's using credentials, the question is it the first time it's authenticating, or is it not the first time? Because so if it's rebooted, it's going to be a lot like a wireless network. It depends on how it's configured. The poor way to configure, if it's poorly configured, right, it's just blindly accepting untrusted certificates. That's not really something you see in Windows, because actually Windows has actually gotten a lot better about dealing with that. Android is an area where you'd see this, so that's not really as applicable here. It would just connect, it would just submit the credentials. In the case of Windows, you'd probably see a prompt. So then the user is going to have to enter in, essentially whatever 802.1x password is going to have to go there, and they're going to enter it in. That stuff is going to be kind of sent, to the rogue device. Sir. Yep. And all these attacks were against printers and IoT crap, right? The second attacks were against printers and IoT crap. The first attack was against basically everything. Yeah, but using TLS certs. Yeah, then you're fine. Yeah, which is. So if it's done right, you're basically telling the client if you do a pen test, yeah, all this is good, but that doesn't really protect you because all you do is find it. Right. Tentatively, you're saying if it's done right, all this will protect you, but you could still enter using the peripheral devices. Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of that's kind of same as it ever was. Yeah, essentially. I mean, it's kind of like one of those things where you have to look at, individual controls.
If the client has good wireless network, but we have a pre-shared key network for barcode scanners, and that's the thing.
Provided they're not, properly segregated from one another, yes. But, I mean, yeah, essentially, I mean, you're right. You have to look at the environment as an ecosystem. And if you start weakening one, you can have amazing security in this aspect, but, this little thing that you think is, I've been told to stop, is inconsequential, will affect the other stuff. I guess, yeah, we can keep talking if you want to ask questions. I just have to get off the stage. But, thanks, guys. Why am I clapping? I'm just, I'm tired. I look like Kim Jong-il up here. You know what I mean? Like, thanks. Thanks, appreciate it. Do you really?